If you are overwhelmed by the complexity of figure drawing, we'll be going over a simple stick figure method to establish the figure step by step. Before we begin, here are some requirements. You should be able to draw clean lines, circles, and simple shapes. You should also be able to extend lines without getting too messy. Some boxes and cylinders will be nice. I will be going over some basic proportions, nothing in details, just enough cheats and hacks to get you going, as well as some basic measuring techniques. Start with a simple ellipse or Loomis head for the head. Add a triangle shape to establish the pit of the neck as some estimated line for the side of the neck. Now we will establish the angle of the shoulder line. It's a little bit higher than the pit of the neck. Next, we will find the shoulder points with a triangulation method. The shoulder point are the bony bumps on the shoulders that you can feel. On the reference, look for a line that crosses the shoulder bump and also touches the circle of the head, but not crossing it. Now we have two angles, and where they cross is where the shoulder bump would be. Now do it for the other side as well. Next, we will use a similar method to triangulate for the pelvis point at the bottom of the torso. As before, we will need 2 base points. You can use any points that we have established so far, but I will be using the pit of the neck to establish the first angle. Now we can pick another point for the second angle, and where they meet is roughly where the pelvis point is. Alternatively, or as a double check, we can count the number of heads down from the top to the pelvis point. It looks like it's roughly 4 heads, so we know where this angle ends. It kind of agrees with our previous measurements. Keep in mind that these are just measurement lines. We can finally establish the actual center line using a simple curve. At this phase of the drawing, make sure you only use simple S-curves, C-curves, or straights. Now connect the shoulder points to the pelvis points as well. At this point, you can clean up any measurement lines. And next, we will triangulate for the side of the pelvis bones. On the side of the waist, you'll often see these very complicated bumps where many of the muscles connect. The important point isn't exactly where you pick, but make sure the points you pick are somewhat symmetric left and right. As before, to start triangulating, we'll need 2 base points. By now, we have many options. I'll use the neighboring pelvis point here. It's close and it's an easy angle, almost horizontal. For the second point, I see that we are almost straight down from the pit of the neck. Technically, there's a slight angle, but unfortunately, I didn't notice it here. For the other side, we'll need 2 base points to establish our 2 angles as well. The first one will be the pelvis point. It's pretty much straight up and down from here. We can use a second angle from another point, but as an alternative, I'll introduce the idea of using a rhythm line as a measuring tool. I see that there's a really nice gesture line, a long line coming from the pit of the neck, connecting the arm and out towards the leg. I'll air trace this with my pencil over this rhythm and see if I can bring it back to my drawing and kind of use that as my second angle, even though it's not a straight line. Next, we'll roughly put in circles for the pelvis and the rib cage. I completely failed for the pelvis circle. Again, I should have warmed up more with circles beforehand. I treat them like placeholders, but you can be more precise by triangulating for the length of the rib cage. Next, we will roughly estimate the width of the upper arm. Eyeball it or quickly do a size comparison with the height of the head. Find the placement of the hand with another pair of angles. Again, you're welcome to pick any established landmarks for the base points. Fight against instincts to add extra details or use complex lines at this point. A major skill we're training ourselves at this point is to learn to see basic shapes and lines in abstract, and also appreciate what a good line looks like within the context of the figure. As beginners, our instinct is to always try to cover our uncertainty and errors with noises and complexity, which delay us from overcoming our weaknesses in design and measurements. For the other arm, I'm mostly eyeballing it. The neighborhood around the torso is well established. We can make placements of the elbow and the wrist with a fair amount of confidence without rigorous measurements. But to be more rigorous, do triangulate different points with the relative check to the head height and triangulations. As in the standing figure video, we'll be using simple arced triangles for the hand. Next, for the left leg, we'll establish where the knee ends and its thickness. We need the bottom of the knee and the inside of the knee. Since the thigh is coming out at us, it will seem very short. Add cross contours like cylinders to help our eyes adjust to this. Now triangulate for where the foot is. For the other leg, I use the pelvis point and the newly established bottom of the left knee to determine its endpoint via triangulation. Taper the leg towards the ankle. I didn't check the ankle width relative to other established parts like the wrist or the head height. It looks a bit too thick. Again, try to fight against premature complications and use simple lines. Notice I only slightly accented the big straight line, even though her leg is much more defined. Before you move on to details, put down your pencils and take a moment to look at these simple constructions. See where you could have simplified even more, or see where something looks off, proportion-wise. For example, I see my ankles might both be too thick. Observe the negative shapes, make corrections, or if you're on a computer, use transformation tools for simple corrections. Lightly erase your constructions or turn down the opacity and draw on a new layer. Now we can add details. If you've established a solid grid, you barely have to make any accent marks at this stage and accentuate extra curves that you would like to see for your own preferences. Make sure you draw in the proper overlaps, meaning if one shape or mass is in front of the other, its outline will block out the other, and we have to make sure that they don't crisscross. I'm adding perspective notes of how I want the different masses to stand in space so they can look more 3D without the rendering. Notice in the reference, the left arm actually looks more like the left cylinder, but I've actually drawn in the cross contour as if it were the right cylinder. It's just a slight exaggeration that I tend to like to do. Start with a simple circle and add a corner for the face. Draw a line down for the neck. Now establish the shoulder angle at the bottom of the neck. According to the Reilly grid map, there are 3 lines to establish for the profiles here, but for brevity, I'll only be using the front and back silhouette lines. First, establish the front center line by triangulating the pelvis point. Again, here, there are multiple options to start our triangulation. I'll use the neck point to establish the first angle, and then we can use a second angle to find out where the pelvis point is on the first angle. Again, alternatively, I can do a quick head count to see how far down the pelvis point is from the top. Draw in the curve of the front silhouette lines and clean up the measuring lines. Now we'll establish the back silhouette. In this case, it's also the back center line. Its endpoint is roughly where the tailbone is, or the top of the butt crack. I triangulate for where the clothing line is here. I think that's roughly where the tailbone is. Now draw in a rough placeholder circles for rib cage, pelvis, and maybe the shoulders. Next, we will establish the arms. Start by triangulating the location of the left arm. In this case, I see it's roughly straight down from where the shoulder line is. The right arm is obscured in the back. I roughly drew in some estimation lines for now. Next, we'll find the top of the knee. You can triangulate from existing landmarks. Here, I'll introduce an additional measurement tool. Oftentimes, we call it measuring by the negative shape. You can see that there's an obvious triangle here created between the arm and the torso. I make an estimation copy and make small adjustments to make the triangle look as close to the reference as possible. Then I drop down from the top of the knee to the bottom. There isn't much wiggle room here. It has to be above the left hand. And from here, a quick horizontal line to establish the lower leg. For the other leg, I triangulate for the front of the knee and estimated the backside by tapering slightly from the butt. Finally, the last point is the tip of the right leg. First, I established one angle from the bottom knee point. Next, again, I use a rhythm line of the whole body. It's a pretty risky move, so you could try double checking this with another angle. Now onto cleanup stage. Sometimes I make perspective marks in the grid that needs to be corrected, but other times the perspective marks are completely straight from our point of view, so I exaggerate them a little so they look more 3D. Make sure you observe the proper overlapping relations and don't crisscross your intersections. Thanks for watching. Leave a comment or a question, like and subscribe. That would be much appreciated.